The carriage wheels clattered against the frozen cobblestones of London as Lady Eleanor Ravenshade pressed her gloved hand against the frost-etched window. December had descended upon England with particular cruelty that year, wrapping the city in layers of ice and shadow that seemed to mirror the coldness settling into her own life. 3 months had passed since her husband's death, and each day had brought fresh revelations of the destruction he had left in his wake. The solicitor's office loomed ahead, its windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk. Eleanor drew a breath that felt like shards of glass in her lungs. She had worn her finest mourning dress, black silk with jet beading that caught what little light penetrated the grey afternoon, not out of respect for the dead, but as armour for the battle she knew awaited her inside. Mr. Pemberton rose from behind his mahogany desk as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. He was a man who had perfected the art of delivering devastating news, with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. "Lady Ravenshade, please, do sit." She remained standing. "The lands in Derbyshire, my father's estate. You summoned me here to discuss their status." "Indeed." Pemberton shuffled papers with deliberate slowness. "I'm afraid the situation is rather more complicated than we initially understood. Your late husband, Lord Ravenshade, accumulated substantial debts before his passing, debts that he secured against various properties." "Those lands were mine before the marriage," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor beginning in her hands. "They were part of my dowry, held in trust. Legally, Lady Ravenshade, upon marriage, all property becomes your husband's to manage as he sees fit. The trust your father established was circumvented through certain legal mechanisms. Lord Ravenshade pledged the Derbyshire estate as collateral for loans totalling nearly £20,000. The number struck her like a physical blow. £20,000. It might as well have been 20 million. The room tilted slightly, and Eleanor gripped the back of the chair before her. "To whom are these debts owed?" "Various creditors, moneylenders, gentlemen's clubs, certain establishments in less reputable quarters of the city." Pemberton cleared his throat. "The largest portion is owed to the Blackmore estate." "Blackmore?" The name fell from her lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through her memory. Everyone in England knew that name. Duke Alistair Blackmore commanded wealth that rivaled the crown itself, controlled parliamentary votes with a mere gesture, and moved through society like a dark star around which all others orbited. "The Duke has acquired most of your late husband's debts," Pemberton continued. "He now holds claim to the Derbyshire property unless the sum can be repaid in full within 60 days. 60 days. Eleanor's mind raced through calculations she already knew were futile. Her widow's portion barely covered her modest lodgings in London. She had jewellery she could sell, but nothing that would approach such a sum. The Derbyshire estate represented not just property, but her last connection to her father. The only haven where she had known true happiness before her marriage had transformed her life into a gilded cage. "Is there nothing to be done?" she asked, hating the pleading note that crept into her voice. "No legal recourse?" "I'm afraid not, my lady. The documents are quite legal, if morally questionable. Your husband was thorough in his dissipation." Pemberton's expression softened marginally. "If I may speak frankly, the Duke's acquisition of these debts is curious. Men of his station rarely involve themselves directly in such matters. He typically employs agents for debt collection." This observation lodged itself in Eleanor's mind like a thorn. Why would England's most powerful duke personally concern himself with the debts of a minor lord's estate? She rose, gathering what remained of her dignity around her like a cloak. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Pemberton. Please send any further correspondence to my residence." The winter air struck her face as she emerged onto the street, sharp and clarifying. Her carriage waited, but Eleanor waved the driver off. She needed to walk, to move, to think. The fashionable squares of Mayfair lay before her, their townhouses decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons in preparation for Christmas celebrations that felt obscenely cheerful against her circumstances. She had been naive once, believing that marriage to Lord Ravenshade would provide security and partnership. He had been charming during their courtship, attentive and seemingly devoted. The truth had revealed itself slowly, like rot spreading beneath painted wood. The gambling, the mistresses, the endless, inexplicable rage that had kept her walking on eggshells through 5 years of marriage until fever had finally claimed him. Now she stood alone in a society that offered widows sympathy but little practical assistance. Without the Derbyshire estate, she would be dependent on distant relatives who had already made clear their reluctance to support her. She would become one of those faded women who haunt the edges of society, forever grateful for small kindnesses, her independence and dignity slowly eroding until nothing remained but genteel poverty and regret. The thought kindled something fierce in her chest. She had survived her marriage. She had endured things that would have broken weaker women. She would not surrender the last piece of her father's legacy without a fight, even if she had no idea what form that fight might take. A commotion ahead drew her attention. A crowd had gathered near the corner of Park Lane, and through the press of bodies, she glimpsed a magnificent black carriage bearing a crest she recognized immediately. A raven and a tower, the Blackmore Arms. The crowd parted as footmen in silver livery cleared a path, and then she saw him. Duke Alistair Blackmore moved through the world as though it had been created specifically for his passage. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black that made him look like a slice of midnight carved from the winter afternoon, he carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. His features were angular and aristocratic, his dark hair swept back from a face that would have been beautiful if not for the hardness in his grey eyes, eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. Those eyes found hers across the crowd. Eleanor felt the moment like a physical impact. The Duke's gaze locked onto her with an intensity that made the noisy street fade into silence. For 3 heartbeats, they regarded each other across the distance, predator and prey, though she could not have said which was which. Then someone jostled her from behind, breaking the spell, and when she looked again, he was stepping into his carriage, the door closing behind him with a decisive thud. She stood frozen as the carriage rolled past, so close she could have reached out and touched its gleaming black panels. Through the window she caught one more glimpse of that aristocratic profile, and then he was gone, leaving her standing on the street corner with her heart hammering inexplicably against her ribs. That evening, alone in her small rented rooms in Bloomsbury, Eleanor tried to distract herself with correspondence and household accounts, but her mind kept returning to that moment of connection, to the strange electricity that had passed between them. She told herself it meant nothing. Great men noticed nothing beyond their own concerns. The Duke had probably already forgotten her face. The knock came at 9 o'clock, startling her from her melancholy reverie. Her maid, Sally, opened the door to reveal a footman in silver livery holding a sealed letter on a silver tray. For Lady Ravensshade, from His Grace the Duke of Blackmore. He awaits a reply. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The paper was heavy, expensive, bearing a subtle watermark of the Blackmore crest. The handwriting was bold and decisive, slashing across the page with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Lady Ravensshade, I find myself in need of a particular service, and circumstances suggest you are uniquely positioned to provide it. I would like to propose a business arrangement that I believe will prove mutually beneficial. I will call upon you tomorrow at 2 o'clock to discuss the matter in person. I trust this time is convenient. Blackmore. No pleasantries, no explanation, just the assumption that she would be available, that she would comply. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings between the stark sentences. A business arrangement, mutually beneficial. The words felt simultaneously promising and dangerous. She looked up at the waiting footman. Please inform His Grace that I will receive him at 2 o'clock. After the footman departed, Eleanor moved to her window, staring out at the London night. Gas lamps flickered in the darkness like trapped stars. Somewhere out there, the Duke of Blackmore sat in his grand mansion, manipulating the lives of lesser beings like pieces on a chessboard. And tomorrow, she would discover what move he intended to make with her. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the city. Carriages rattling past, distant voices, the eternal heartbeat of London that never truly slept. Questions circled through her mind like restless birds. What could the Duke possibly want from her? Why had he acquired her husband's debts? What service could a powerless widow provide to a man who commanded the attention of Parliament and the Crown? By morning she had exhausted herself with speculation and achieved no answers. Sally helped her dress with special care, choosing a day dress of deep purple, half mourning, acknowledging her widowhood, but suggesting she was emerging from the deepest grief. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple style that emphasized her fine features, and she wore her mother's pearls at her throat. If she was to negotiate with England's most powerful duke, she would meet him as an equal, at least in appearance. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor tried to read, to sew, to occupy herself with mundane tasks, but her attention scattered like leaves in wind. At 1:30 she positioned herself in her small drawing room, arranging herself in a chair that faced the door, composing her features into an expression of calm interest she did not feel. At precisely 2 o'clock, the knock came. Sally ushered the Duke into the room, and suddenly the modest space felt absurdly small, overwhelmed by his presence. He filled the doorway, his greatcoat still bearing traces of the cold outside, his grey eyes scanning the room with the same calculating intensity she remembered from the street. "Lady Ravenshade." He bowed with perfect courtesy, but there was something predatory in the gesture, as though he were a wolf observing the social niceties before closing in for the kill. "Your Grace." She remained seated, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Please." He settled into the chair with a grace surprising in a man of his size, declining tea with a slight gesture. For a moment they regarded each other in silence, and Eleanor understood that this was a test. He was waiting to see if she would fill the silence with nervous chatter, if she would betray weakness. She waited. A hint of something, amusement, approval, flickered in his eyes. "I will be direct, Lady Ravenshade. I am in possession of debts that give me claim to the Derbyshire property you inherited from your father. I imagine Mr. Pemberton has explained your situation." "He has." Her voice remained steady, though he could not explain why a duke would personally involve himself in collecting the debts of a deceased minor lord. "Because I wanted your attention." The admission was startling in its honesty. "I have a proposition for you, one that requires delicacy and discretion." "I'm listening." He leaned forward slightly, and Eleanor caught a scent of sandalwood and something darker, more complex. "In 3 days, I am hosting the annual Blackmore Christmas Ball. It is the most significant social event of the season. Members of Parliament, foreign dignitaries, peers of the realm and certain influential persons whose names rarely appear in the society pages." "I'm aware of the ball's reputation," Eleanor said. Indeed, she had attended years ago before her marriage, when her father had still been alive and she had been a fresh-faced debutante. She remembered the grandeur of Blackmore House, the way power had hung in the air like expensive perfume. "I need you to attend as my intended bride." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "For one evening, you will play the role of my fiancé. You will arrive on my arm, stand at my side during the receiving line, dance with me and convince 300 of England's most perceptive individuals that we are genuinely, ardently engaged to be married." "That's absurd." The words escaped before she could stop them. "Your Grace, we've never even been properly introduced. No one would believe—" "They will believe what I tell them to believe." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I will announce that we met recently, that our courtship has been private due to your mourning period, and that I convinced you that love is more important than society's arbitrary timelines. The ton loves a romantic story, especially one involving a powerful duke and a beautiful widow." Beautiful. The word hung between them, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She pushed past it, focusing on the practical impossibility of his request. "Why? What could you possibly gain from such a deception?" "That is my concern." His expression closed like a door slamming shut. "You need only know that I have my reasons, and they are sufficient. And in exchange for this performance, you would return my father's lands." In exchange for your convincing performance, I will forgive all debts associated with the property and return it to your name free and clear. The necessary documents will be prepared and delivered to you the morning after the ball. It was too much, too easy. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications, searching for the trap she knew must exist. One evening of pretense, and I receive property worth thousands of pounds. One evening of absolutely flawless pretense, he corrected. If at any moment I believe you are failing to convince our guests, the offer is void. Additionally, you will be required to maintain the fiction for 2 weeks following the ball, appearing with me at select events until I announce that we have mutually agreed to end our engagement. 2 weeks. She repeated the time frame, calculating. 2 weeks of living a lie, of allowing London society to believe she was engaged to this dangerous man. 2 weeks of navigating whatever game he was playing, a game whose rules he refused to share. And after these 2 weeks, you simply announce that we've ended our engagement. Won't that create scandal? I will ensure the narrative protects your reputation. A mutual decision, conflicting priorities, continued respect, and affection. The usual formulas. You will emerge from the experience as a woman who captured the Duke of Blackmore's heart, even if circumstances prevented the marriage. That association alone will elevate your social standing considerably. He was right, Eleanor realized. Even a failed engagement to the Duke would transform her from a powerless widow into a woman of consequence, someone who had stood at the pinnacle of society, however briefly. But the calculation in his eyes suggested he knew exactly how tempting his offer was, how perfectly it was calibrated to exploit her desperation. "What if I refuse?" she asked, needing to understand the full scope of her choices. "Then the legal process proceeds as Mr. Pemberton outlined. The Derbyshire property will be liquidated to satisfy the debts within 60 days. You will receive nothing." He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over her. "I'm offering you a path to keep what is rightfully yours, Lady Ravenshade. The price is a few evenings of play acting, hardly an exorbitant cost, unless there are costs you're not mentioning." Eleanor met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. What happens if this deception is discovered? What happens if someone challenges our story? No one will. I am very good at getting what I want. The statement was not a boast, but a simple fact, delivered with the same certainty one might use to discuss the rising of the sun. However, should any complications arise, you have my word that I will protect you from any consequences. Whatever happens, you will not suffer. His word. She had no reason to trust it, no reason to believe that a man who would orchestrate such an elaborate deception had any honor at all. Yet she found herself wanting to believe him, and that impulse frightened her more than anything else about this impossible situation. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow evening. Send word to Blackmore House with your decision." He rose, and she stood as well, acutely aware that the top of her head barely reached his shoulder. He looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I hope you will accept, Lady Ravenshade. I think we could accomplish great things together." "You mean you could accomplish whatever mysterious goal you're pursuing, and I would recover my property?" "Precisely." He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features into something almost charming. "I appreciate a woman who understands the nature of transactions. So few people do these days." He bowed again and turned toward the door, but stopped with his hand on the frame. "One more thing. The ball has a theme this year, Winter's Enchantment. You'll need an appropriate gown. I'll send my seamstress tomorrow morning. She's discreet and efficient." "I haven't agreed yet," Eleanor protested. "But you will." He looked back at her with absolute confidence. "You're far too intelligent to refuse the best offer you're likely to receive. Good day, Lady Ravenshade." Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sandalwood and the impression that a storm had just passed through her quiet rooms. The seamstress arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying bolts of fabric that shimmered like captured moonlight. Madame Rousseau was a tiny Frenchwoman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and she swept through Eleanor's modest rooms with the confidence of someone accustomed to dressing royalty. "His Grace has exquisite taste," she announced, unfurling a length of silver silk that caught the weak winter sunlight and transformed it into something magical. He selected this fabric himself. Very particular, the Duke. He said it must complement your colouring perfectly. Eleanor stood motionless as the woman's practiced hands measured and pinned, draping fabric across her shoulders and waist with the precision of an artist creating a masterpiece. She had spent the entire night wrestling with the Duke's proposition, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle box, whose solution remained frustratingly out of reach. Every practical consideration pointed toward acceptance. She would be a fool to refuse. Yet something about the intensity in Alistair Blackmore's eyes, the careful way he had crafted his offer, suggested currents running far deeper than he had revealed. "How you are troubled, madam," Madame Rousseau observed, her fingers deftly marking adjustments with chalk. "But you should not be. To catch the eye of such a man, this is remarkable, no?" "We are not actually engaged," Eleanor said, then immediately regretted the admission. The seamstress merely smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she had heard every secret the aristocracy possessed. "Of course not yet, madame. But these things have a way of becoming real, especially when a man like the Duke decides he wants something. I have dressed his mother, his sisters, even the woman he was meant to marry 10 years ago. Never have I seen him take such personal interest in a lady's wardrobe." There was someone he was meant to marry? The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it. Lady Caroline Ashworth. Beautiful girl, very suitable. Madame Rousseau's expression grew thoughtful as she adjusted the drape of fabric across Eleanor's shoulders. The engagement was arranged by their families when they were children. Everyone expected them to wed. But something happened. No one quite knows what. And the Duke broke the engagement 3 days before the wedding. Lady Caroline married a French count and moved to Paris. The Duke has remained unmarried ever since. The revelation lodged itself in Eleanor's mind like a splinter. A broken engagement. A decade of remaining unmarried despite the pressure that must exist for a man of his station to produce an heir. What could have happened to make him walk away from a carefully arranged match? And what did it mean that he was now asking her to play the role of his fiancée? "Turn, please," Madame Rousseau commanded, and Eleanor rotated slowly, her reflection fragmenting across the trio of mirrors the assistants had positioned around her. The woman she saw looked unfamiliar, not the grieving widow or the desperate supplicant, but someone else entirely, someone who might conceivably stand beside a duke and appear to belong there. "The gown will be ready by tomorrow evening," Madame Rousseau announced with satisfaction. "You will be magnificent, madam. His Grace will not be able to take his eyes from you." After the seamstress departed, Eleanor sat at her writing desk, a blank piece of paper before her and a pen in her hand. She needed to send her answer to Blackmore House, accept or refuse, reclaim her father's legacy or surrender to the slow erosion of poverty and dependence. The decision should have been simple, yet her hand remained frozen above the paper. A knock interrupted her paralysis. Sally entered carrying a calling card on a silver tray. "Lady Pemberton requests a visit, ma'am. Shall I tell her you're not receiving?" Lady Pemberton was the solicitor's wife, a gossip of the first order who somehow always knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. The last person Eleanor wanted to see. Yet refusing visitors would only fuel speculation about her circumstances. "Show her in." The woman swept into the room in a rustle of expensive taffeta, her eyes already cataloguing every detail of Eleanor's modest furnishings. "My dear Lady Ravenshade, I simply had to call. I heard the most extraordinary rumour, and I told myself it couldn't possibly be true, but I had to see for myself." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What rumour would that be?" "That you were seen speaking with the Duke of Blackmore yesterday afternoon, on Park Lane of all places. And then," Lady Pemberton leaned forward conspiratorially, "his carriage was observed outside your residence for nearly half an hour. My dear, the speculation is absolutely rampant. So quickly." The machinery of society gossip moved with terrifying efficiency. Eleanor forced herself to remain calm, to show nothing. "The Duke came to discuss a business matter related to my late husband's estate. Nothing more." Business? Lady Pemberton's tone suggested she believed no such thing. How very modern, though I must say the Duke has been looking rather purposeful lately. My husband mentioned that His Grace has been consolidating various political alliances, calling in favours, positioning himself for something significant. Parliament reconvenes in January, and there are whispers of major legislation that could reshape trade agreements with the continent. The information slid into place like another piece of the puzzle Eleanor was trying to solve. Political maneuvering, alliances and positioning, a ball that brought together the most powerful people in England, and a fake engagement that would serve some purpose the Duke refused to explain. What role could she possibly play in whatever scheme he was orchestrating? "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about parliamentary matters," Eleanor said carefully. "Of course not, dear." Lady Pemberton rose, her mission of extracting information clearly unsuccessful. "But do be careful. The Duke is a man of considerable power, and some say considerable ruthlessness. Whatever business you have with him, protect yourself. Men of that station rarely concern themselves with the welfare of those beneath them." After the woman left, Eleanor returned to her desk. The warning echoed in her mind, mixing with Madame Rousseau's observations and her own instincts. She thought of Alistair Blackmore's eyes, the way they had calculated her worth in that first glance. She was not naive enough to believe he cared about her welfare or felt any genuine attraction. She was a tool, carefully selected for some specific purpose. But perhaps tools could have purposes of their own. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote with swift, decisive strokes. "Your Grace, I accept your proposition with the following conditions. First, I require a written contract specifying the exact terms of our arrangement and the timeline for the property transfer. Second, I must be informed of any situations at the ball where my performance will be particularly scrutinized. Third, should circumstances arise that deviate significantly from what you've described, I reserve the right to end the arrangement immediately. If these terms are acceptable, I await further instructions. E. Ravenshade." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, summoned Sally to deliver it to Blackmore House, and then paced her small drawing room like a caged animal. What had she just committed herself to? What game was she now part of? The reply arrived within 2 hours. The Duke's handwriting was even more forceful than before, as though he had pressed the pen into the paper with particular intensity. "Lady Ravenshade, your conditions are acceptable. A contract will be delivered this evening. As for situations requiring particular attention, be prepared to convince Lord Halifax that our engagement is genuine. He is perhaps the most perceptive man in England, and the greatest obstacle to certain plans I have in motion. If he believes our connection is real, everyone else will follow. A carriage will collect you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Wear the gown Madame Rousseau is creating and the jewellery that will be delivered with this letter. We will arrive at the ball together, as a newly engaged couple should. One more thing. When we dance, follow my lead in all things. Trust me, even when you don't understand, especially then." A. The use of his initial rather than his title felt oddly intimate, and Eleanor found herself staring at that single letter as though it might reveal secrets. The package that accompanied his note contained a velvet box holding a necklace of diamonds and sapphires that must have cost more than her entire year's income. The stones caught the lamplight and threw fractured rainbows across her walls, beautiful and cold. She lifted the necklace from its velvet bed, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was real. Tomorrow night she would enter Blackmore House on the Duke's arm, wearing jewels that proclaimed her his intended bride, and perform for an audience of England's elite. The enormity of it struck her suddenly, and she had to sit down, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What if she failed? What if Lord Halifax saw through the deception immediately? What if she stumbled over some detail, gave away the lie with a careless word or gesture? The Duke had promised to protect her from consequences, but could he really shield her from the scandal that would erupt if their scheme was discovered? The contract arrived that evening, delivered by a lawyer so discreet he barely made eye contact. The terms were exactly as the Duke had specified: perform convincingly for one evening and select subsequent events over 2 weeks, and the Derbyshire property would be transferred to her name, free of all encumbrances. There was even a clause stating that should the arrangement end early due to circumstances beyond her control, she would receive a financial settlement sufficient to maintain her independence. He had thought of everything. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Alistair Blackmore was a man who left nothing to chance, who anticipated every contingency. What did that say about his character? And what did it mean for her that she was now bound to him by contract and conspiracy? Eleanor signed her name with a steady hand, witnessed by the lawyer, and watched him depart with the document that now legally obligated her to deceive London society. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no returning to the woman she had been before. The following day passed in a blur of preparation. Madame Rousseau returned with the completed gown, and when Eleanor saw it, she understood why the Duke had taken such personal interest in its creation. The silver silk seemed to shift between moonlight and starlight with every movement. The bodice fitted to perfection and embroidered with tiny crystals that echoed the brilliance of the sapphire necklace. It was a gown designed to make heads turn, to announce that the woman wearing it was someone of significance. "You look like a duchess already," Sally whispered, as she helped Eleanor into the gown that evening. The maid's eyes were bright with tears. "Your father would be so proud." The mention of her father sent a pang through Eleanor's chest. Would he be proud, or would he be horrified that his daughter was selling herself, even temporarily, to reclaim what should have been hers by right? But her father was 5 years in his grave, beyond judgment or disappointment, and she was alone in a world that offered women precious few paths to independence. At precisely 7 o'clock, the Blackmore carriage arrived. It was even more magnificent than she remembered. Black lacquered wood with silver fittings, the ducal crest emblazoned on the door, 4 matched black horses stamping in the cold. A footman handed her inside, and she settled onto cushions of midnight blue velvet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door opened again, and Alistair Blackmore entered the carriage with that same predatory grace she remembered. He was dressed in formal black evening wear that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean power of his frame. Diamond studs glinted at his cuffs and throat, subtle displays of wealth that didn't need to announce themselves loudly. He took the seat opposite her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. "Magnificent," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that made her shiver. "Madame Rousseau has outdone herself." "The gown is beautiful," Eleanor managed, acutely aware of how small the carriage felt with both of them inside it. "I wasn't speaking of the gown." His eyes held hers, and she saw something flicker in their depths, appreciation, calculation, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Though it is indeed spectacular. Are you ready for this, Lady Ravenshade?" "I signed your contract. I'm here. Whether I'm ready is perhaps irrelevant at this point." A smile touched his lips. "Honest. Good. I need you sharp tonight, not simpering. Remember, Lord Halifax will be watching. He's a man who has made his fortune reading people, understanding their motivations and weaknesses. He will look for any crack in our story." "Then perhaps you should tell me more about this story we're supposed to be telling," Eleanor suggested. "How did we meet? When did you propose? What made you suddenly decide to marry after a decade of avoiding it?" The carriage began to move, rolling through the London streets toward Mayfair and the grand townhouse that would serve as the stage for their performance. Alistair leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "We met 6 weeks ago at a poetry reading hosted by Lady Ashford. You were in the back of the room, and I noticed you because you were the only person actually listening to the appalling verse being recited. Everyone else was busy with social posturing." "I do enjoy poetry," Eleanor said, surprised by the detail. "I know. It's in the report my investigator compiled about you." He said it casually, as though having her investigated was the most natural thing in the world. "I asked you to walk with me in Lady Ashford's garden, and we discovered a shared love of Wordsworth and a mutual disdain for society's more ridiculous conventions. We began meeting quietly. Your mourning period made public courtship inappropriate, and I fell in love with your intelligence and independence." "How romantic," Eleanor said dryly. "Romance is what we're selling tonight. As for why I've remained unmarried, the story is that I was waiting for a woman who wanted me for myself, not my title or wealth. You, having married once for duty and suffered for it, understand that desire. We recognized something real in each other." The narrative was surprisingly believable, built on kernels of truth that made the lies easier to swallow. Eleanor studied the man across from her, trying to reconcile the calculating strategist with the romantic figure he was asking her to portray. "And Lord Halifax? What is he to you that his opinion matters so much?" He controls votes in Parliament that I need for legislation I'm proposing, trade agreements with Prussia that could transform England's economic position. Halifax is skeptical of my motives. He thinks I'm consolidating power for personal gain rather than national benefit. A marriage, especially to someone like you, suggests stability and genuine concern for legacy rather than mere ambition. Someone like me, Eleanor repeated. What exactly does that mean? A woman of quality who has suffered misfortune through no fault of her own. A woman choosing to marry for love rather than necessity, which suggests that I am worthy of such a choice. He leaned forward slightly. You are the human face of my ambitions, Lady Ravenshade. You make me appear less ruthless, more sympathetic. That is your role tonight. The honesty was almost brutal, but Eleanor found she preferred it to pretty lies. At least she knew exactly where she stood. And after tonight, after these 2 weeks, what happens when you announce our engagement has ended? I will ensure the narrative emphasizes that we remain friendly, that circumstances rather than any failure of affection ended things. You will be seen as the woman who civilized the Duke of Blackmore, if only briefly. That reputation will serve you well. The carriage slowed, and through the window, Eleanor saw Blackmore House rising before them like a palace carved from moonlight and ambition. Every window blazed with light, and guests were already arriving in a glittering procession of carriages. Music drifted through the winter air, and she could see crowds gathering to watch the arrivals, hoping to glimpse the powerful and beautiful. Alistair reached across the space between them and took her hand. His fingers were warm, strong, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. From this moment forward we are deeply in love. Every gesture, every glance must convince them. Can you do that? Eleanor looked into those grey eyes and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Yes. Then let's give them a performance they'll never forget. The carriage door opened, and a wall of sound crashed over them. Music, conversation, the rustle of expensive fabric and the chime of crystal. Alistair stepped out first, then turned to hand Eleanor down, his grip firm and possessive. As her feet touched the ground, she heard the gasps, saw heads turning, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes fixing upon her. The Duke of Blackmore tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. Smile, darling. Our future depends on it. And Eleanor smiled, brilliant and genuine, as they ascended the steps into the glittering heart of English society, into a web of deception that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The music swelled, the doors opened before them, and they stepped forward together into the light. The music rose around them like a living tide as they stepped into the blaze of light. For a moment, Eleanor could do nothing but breathe and look. Blackmore House, dressed for Christmas, was almost unreal. Garlands of evergreen and holly twined along the balustrades and pillars, threaded with white satin ribbons and tiny glass ornaments that caught the candlelight like frozen drops of rain. Clusters of white roses and winter berries stood in crystal vases high as her waist. The chandeliers, a dozen of them, dropped like cascades of ice from a painted ceiling, flooding the marble floor with brilliance. The air smelled of beeswax, pine, and the faint spice of mulled wine. And everywhere there were eyes. The hum of conversation changed timbre, curiosity sharpening it to a bright metallic edge. Fans stilled mid-flutter. A gentleman's laugh died on his lips. Faces turned toward them, toward him and therefore toward her, with frank interest, surprise, hunger for new information. News in London travelled quickly, rumour travelled faster. The Duke of Blackmore, long an unshakable bachelor, had arrived with a woman no one had expected. Alistair's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his grip an anchor. "Steady," he said softly, without moving his lips. "They can scent fear." "Like wolves," she murmured back, allowing the corner of her mouth to lift. "Exactly like wolves, and half of them owe me money." The dry quip steadied her more than any grave reassurance would have done. She let her shoulders settle, lifted her chin, and remembered her training from a lifetime ago. How to walk into a room as if she belonged there, even when part of her wished only to flee. Her father had always said that confidence, properly worn, was a better gown than any silk. Your Grace," someone called, and the spell of silence shattered. The crowd surged subtly closer, the movement carefully disguised as polite milling, but unmistakable to someone watching for it. They wanted to see, to measure, to decide what to think. Eleanor could almost feel the questions moving through the room like a separate current. Who is she? How did she catch him? Is it love, or something else? Alistair led her not to the receiving line near the entrance. Such a place would have seemed too formal, too staged, but directly into the heart of the gathering, where ministers and peers stood beneath a great arched window framed by swags of evergreen. His choice was deliberate. If they were to sell the illusion of sudden ardent affection, they must enter as though they had simply flowed naturally into the existing pattern of the evening. Blackmore! A florid gentleman with an impressive waistcoat and an equally impressive moustache hailed them, his eyes already gleaming with gossip. "You scoundrel, you might have given us some warning." "If I had, you would have spoiled my fun, Fitzroy," Alistair returned easily. "And you would have had the story half over London before breakfast." Fitzroy laughed, then turned a frankly assessing gaze upon Eleanor. "And this is the lady who has managed what the entire ton despaired of. Ma'am, you have the respects of every ambitious mother in England. They will be cursing your name for months." Alistair's hand tightened for a fraction of a second on her arm. Eleanor let herself laugh lightly, as if delighted rather than intimidated. "Then perhaps it is best I remain behind Blackmore for protection," she answered. "I doubt I could withstand the force of their combined displeasure." Fitzroy's eyes warmed with approval. "Quick-witted. I see why he broke form for you. My dear, allow me to present—" The introductions began, and soon Eleanor was caught in a whirl of names, titles, and carefully modulated responses. Alistair did not leave her side. He presented her as if there were no question she belonged beside him. "My fiancée, Lady Eleanor Ravenshade." The word fiancée rolled off his tongue with such ease that she had to remind herself, again and again, that it was a lie. Yet every time he spoke it, heads tilted, expressions shifted, calculations altered. She could see it happening, almost as if the air itself changed around them. Men who had feared Blackmore's single-minded ambition suddenly saw him as a man with personal stakes, someone who might value peace over conflict because he now had someone to protect. Women whose gossip wielded social power evaluated Eleanor's dress, her bearing, her smile, and decided whether to embrace or undermine her. Old acquaintances of her father blinked in surprise and revised their opinions of the impoverished Ravenshade widow. And above it all, like a shadow moving beneath the surface of still water, she felt the presence of Lord Halifax somewhere in the room, watching. They encountered him sooner than she expected. He was near one of the towering windows, speaking quietly with two younger men whose posture suggested both respect and wariness. When he saw Blackmore approaching, Halifax dismissed his companions with a look. They melted away. "Your Grace." There was a certain grave courtesy in Halifax's bow that he did not extend to everyone. "And this is—" "My fiancée," Alistair said, "Lady Eleanor Ravenshade. Eleanor, this is Lord Halifax, who kindly keeps the Empire from collapsing under the weight of its own accounts." Halifax's gaze moved to her face and stayed there, cool, sharp, searching. "Lady Ravenshade, I knew your father. He would be intrigued by this development." Eleanor inclined her head. "I like to think he would also be pleased, my lord. He held your lordship in very high esteem." "Your father held almost everyone in high esteem," Halifax said dryly. "It was his most endearing flaw." "Tell me," his eyes narrowed just a fraction, "when did you decide you could trust Duke Blackmore with your future? The rest of us have not yet come to that conclusion." There it was, the first test, delivered with the bluntness of a man who had long ago ceased to bother with soft words. Eleanor felt the weight of the question pressing against her like a physical thing. She could not afford to recite rehearsed lines. He would hear the falseness in an instant. She reached instead for the only shield that had ever truly served her, the truth, crafted carefully. "Trust did not come quickly," she said. "My late husband was very charming, Lord Halifax. He was also very good at lying. I have learned to value plain speech more than pretty words." She let her gaze slide briefly toward Alistair, as though including him in a memory. His Grace was the first man of power I have met who did not attempt to disguise his ambitions or his flaws. He offered me a bargain with every sharp edge visible. That kind of honesty is rare. I decided I would rather bind my future to a man whose weapons I can see than to one who hides them. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Halifax's mouth lifted, not quite into a smile, but into something thoughtful. A dangerous philosophy, but not a foolish one. And you, his eyes went to Alistair, found this woman how? In a room full of people flattering a minor poet, Alistair replied, his tone light but his gaze steady. She was the only one listening to the verse itself. Everyone else was listening only to themselves. Halifax huffed, the sound more amused than skeptical. Very well. Either this is the most elaborate piece of theatre I have ever seen, or you have accidentally stumbled into a stroke of wisdom, Blackmore. He inclined his head to Eleanor again. My lady, if you are half as ruthless in protecting his conscience as he is in protecting his interests, the Empire may survive after all. He moved away without waiting for a reply, leaving behind a space that seemed to draw breath. Alistair exhaled, very softly. You handled him perfectly, he murmured. You may have just saved a decade of trade policy. It seems a very grand consequence for a single conversation, she answered, though her heart was still pounding. You underestimate how rarely anyone speaks to Halifax without trying to disguise something. His thumb brushed over her gloved hand, a brief unconscious caress. Come, before they think we exist only to impress him. The next portion of the evening unfolded like a dance, even when they were not on the dance floor. Eleanor found herself moving from circle to circle. Wives of ministers who measured her with practiced eyes and asked gently barbed questions. Young ladies whose curiosity vibrated around them like static. Foreign envoys who bowed over her hand and complimented Alistair on his excellent taste. Through it all, the Duke remained beside her, a steadying presence, stepping in when conversations became too pointed, presenting her as though she were not merely ornament, but equal. When at last the first waltz was called, the entire room seemed to tilt toward them in expectation. Alistair turned to her, extending his hand. May I, my lady? You must, she murmured. They will riot if you do not. He laughed, and something in his expression softened, briefly, unguardedly. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the center of the floor. As the orchestra began to play, couples drew back, forming a wide circle. The Duke of Blackmore and his unknown bride-to-be would have the opening of the dance. The first notes of the waltz rose like a breath held too long. Alistair's hand settled at her waist. The touch was firm, warm through the thin barrier of silk. His other hand cradled hers. For a single heartbeat they stood completely still, eyes locked. Everything else in the room dimmed to a blur at the edges of her vision. Trust me, he said for the second time that night, and breathe. She obeyed. They moved. He was an excellent dancer. That she had expected. What she had not expected was how effortless he made it to follow him. He shaped her path with the slightest pressure of his palm, turning them through the crowded floor in smooth arcs that made her gown flare like liquid silver around her ankles. The chandeliers blurred into streaks of light above them. Her pulse settled into the rhythm of the music, into the rise and fall of their steps. You're staring at me again, she said quietly, aware of his gaze. I'm supposed to be unable to look away, he replied. It happens to be convenient that I find it easy. The admission sent a tiny shock through her, as if someone had plucked an invisible string inside her chest. Around them, she could hear fragments of whispered commentary, broken off by laughter and the occasional delighted little gasp. Their audience was enraptured by the spectacle. The most powerful duke in England, moving with a woman whose history had not prepared her for such a stage, yet who seemed to belong there as naturally as breathing. The dance ended to a soft swell of applause. Alistair bowed over her hand, allowing his lips to brush her knuckles in a gesture so intimate it nearly stole her breath. You were perfect, he said, just loud enough for her ears alone. Shall we give them more to talk about? The rest of the evening became a blur of impressions. Candlelight, the clink of crystal, the murmur of low voices in alcoves where political futures were being negotiated. Eleanor played her part with a focus that surprised even herself. She laughed when appropriate, met questions with poised answers that revealed enough, but never too much, and allowed herself to look at Alistair with open warmth whenever she felt scrutiny upon her. And always, his hand found hers, or settled at the small of her back, or touched her elbow in passing. Not constantly, just enough that anyone watching would believe he could not help reaching for her. Near midnight, when the room had grown hot and the air thick with the scent of too many flowers and too many bodies, he guided her toward a set of French doors that had been opened onto a wide stone terrace. Cold winter air rushed in, welcome and sharp. The terrace overlooked the gardens, now transformed by frost and moonlight into something almost otherworldly. Bare branches painted silver, lawns glittering as if strewn with ground glass. 5 minutes, Alistair told a nearby footman. See that we are not disturbed unless the house catches fire. Yes, Your Grace. Eleanor arched a brow as they stepped outside. Is that a usual instruction? Only when I desperately need air. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. In the moonlight, some of the social polish seemed to fall away, leaving the man beneath, the one who calculated trade routes and parliamentary votes, who acquired debts like hers with deliberate intent, who had chosen her for reasons that had little to do with romance. And yet, "How do you feel?" he asked. "As if I have been thrown into the center of a storm and somehow managed not to drown," she said honestly. "Though it may be that I simply have not yet sunk." He gave a low, genuine laugh. "You were more than afloat in there. Halifax practically glowed at me after speaking with you. That is an expression I have never before seen on his face. I suspect I should be concerned." "You are welcome," she replied, tilting her head. "I will send you a bill for my services." His eyes warmed, the grey deepening. "Name your price." The words were playful. They still landed between them with unexpected weight. She looked away out over the frosted lawn, watching her own breath ghost in the cold air. "You already know my price, Your Grace. You set it, in fact." "The estate," his voice softened. "You will have it. The documents are already in motion." She believed him. That perhaps was the most dangerous part of all. Silence fell, not uncomfortable, but taut with things unsaid. Somewhere behind them, the orchestra began a new tune. Laughter drifted through the open doors, muffled by the distance. "You were right," she said after a moment. "It is easy to sell them this story. They see what they wish to see, and the rest they supply themselves." He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt his warmth against the winter chill. "And what do you see, Eleanor?" The sound of her name in his mouth, without title, without distance, sent another small jolt through her. She kept her gaze on the garden. "I see a man who has convinced the world he feels something he does not. And I see a woman who promised herself she would never again be drawn in by anything resembling affection, and who is dangerously aware that she might be failing at that promise." He was quiet for a long beat. The only sounds were the distant music and the faint clink of glass. "At the start," he said at last, "I chose you because you were useful. You had the right history, the right reputation, and the right desperation. It was a clean transaction in my mind." She flinched just a little, even though she had always known it. "But you keep doing things I did not calculate," he continued. "You tell the truth where I expect lies. You challenge me where others flatter. You look at me as if you can see the man under the title and have not yet decided whether to condemn or forgive him." At last he turned his head, his profile sharp in the moonlight. That was not in the bargain. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh, if it had not caught in her chest. "Affection was not in the bargain either." "No," he said quietly. "It was not." Their eyes met then. No ballroom, no witnesses, no need for pretense, and for one suspended moment the world narrowed to only that line of connection. If he stepped forward and took her in his arms, if he kissed her, she knew with terrifying clarity that she would not stop him. From inside, someone called his name. The spell broke. Alistair closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering himself, then stepped back a fraction. "We should go in," he said. His voice was steady again, the Duke resurfacing over the man. "If we are gone too long, they will imagine all sorts of things." "They already are," she answered. "That is rather the point, is it not?" He gave her his arm. She took it. Together they walked back into the warmth and light. The remainder of the night passed in a series of scenes that would, she knew, be repeated and embellished in drawing rooms for weeks. The Duke of Blackmore smiling down at his bride-to-be as they shared a glass of champagne, the way his hand rested on her waist when they stood together, listening to a minister drone on about tariffs, the soft look on her face when she thought no one was watching, and he spoke into her ear. By the time the last guests departed and the final carriage rattled away, the story of their whirlwind love affair was firmly planted in the collective imagination. It had worked. In the private quiet of the carriage returning her to Bloomsbury, the mask slipped from both of them. "You were flawless," Alistair said at last, breaking the silence. "Halifax pulled me aside just before he left. He will support the legislation. He said, and I quote, that any man who inspires that level of loyalty in a woman might actually be trusted with the nation's interests." Eleanor let her head fall back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. "So your plan succeeds. Congratulations, Your Grace." There was something in her tone that made him study her face. "Our plan," he corrected. "You were not a passive ornament tonight. You were the linchpin. And in 2 weeks," she said softly, opening her eyes to meet his, "you will announce that for reasons of mutual affection and respect, we have decided not to marry after all. You will have your votes. I will have my estate. Society will have its story. That was the bargain." "Yes." The single syllable carried more weight than it should have. "Then we should both remember it," she said. He did not answer immediately. Outside, London's streets slid past in a blur of lamplight and shadow. "When the documents are delivered," he said finally, "there will also be a sum set aside for you. A settlement of sorts. Consider it payment for services rendered." A flicker of anger sparked in her chest, unexpected and hot. "You have already paid me," she said. "I am not one of your transactions to be bought off and filed neatly away in an account book." His jaw tightened. "That was not my intention." "No?" She held his gaze. "Then what was?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again as if the words he wished to say, and the words he could permit himself to say, were in conflict. At last he said only, "I did not want you to be vulnerable. Even with the estate there will be costs, repairs, staff. I thought that you could fix it," she finished quietly, "as you fix everything, with money and strategy." "Yes." Some of the anger melted. It was replaced by something more complicated, softer. "You forget that I am not your Parliament, Your Grace. I am not a ledger to be balanced." She looked down at her hands, still gloved, resting in her lap. "You have given me back my father's lands. That is enough. More than enough." They rode the rest of the way in silence, not quite comfortable, not quite strained. When the carriage stopped before her modest building, he descended first, then turned to hand her down as he had hours before. Dawn was just beginning to grey the sky, London's rooftops etched in cold light. He did not release her hand at once. 2 weeks, he said quietly. Then we pretend to untangle our lives again. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Tell me, Eleanor. He stopped, shook his head as if abandoning the question. No, it is nothing. She, for once, did not press. Some answers, she suspected, would only hurt to hear. Good night, Your Grace, she said instead. Thank you for the evening. He looked at her as though committing her to memory. The silver gown, the pale throat bare now of sapphires, the shadows under her eyes from exhaustion, and too many emotions in too few hours. Then he bent, very properly, and brushed his lips over her gloved fingers. Good night, Lady Ravenshade. She climbed the steps alone. Inside, in the narrow bed that bore no resemblance to the grand four-posters of houses like his, Eleanor lay awake long after the city began to stir. She had entered into a bargain to save her future, convincing herself she could keep her heart out of the transaction. Now, with the echo of his touch still ghosting over her skin and the memory of his eyes in the moonlight refusing to fade, she was no longer certain. At Blackmore House, in a study that smelled of smoke and paper and strategy, Alistair sat before a dying fire, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. The ball had been a triumph by every measurable standard. Halifax was on his side. His position in Parliament was strengthened. The pieces on his invisible board were exactly where he had wanted them, and yet, whenever he closed his eyes, he did not see ledgers or maps or the gleam of chandeliers. He saw a woman in a silver gown stepping into a room full of wolves with her head held high. He heard her say, "I decided I would rather bind my future to a man whose weapons I can see." He felt the ghost of her hand in his. 2 weeks, he had told her. It had seemed, when he made the bargain, like a finite thing, a window of time bounded by clear terms. Now, with the fire collapsing into ash and the first light of morning creeping under the curtains, it felt instead like a fuse burning towards something he could not yet name. He set the untouched brandy aside and pressed his fingers to his temples. The smartest thing he could do now, the safest, the most strategic, would be to keep his distance, except where their performance demanded otherwise. To remember that he had chosen her as a symbol, a tool and nothing more. To let the fiction of love play out exactly as planned, then end it with the tidy grace of a contract fulfilled. It was, he thought grimly, very unfortunate that his heart had never shown much respect for strategy. And somewhere in the cold quiet between one heartbeat and the next, both of them, alone in their separate houses, staring into uncertain futures, understood the same perilous truth. The most dangerous lies are the ones you tell so often, so convincingly, that you begin to wish they were true. After a single night that changes everything, Lady Eleanor Ravenshade and Duke Alistair Blackmore walk away from the glittering halls of Blackmore House with far more than they bargained for. The world has accepted the story they offered, a powerful duke, finally tamed by love, a widowed lady, unexpectedly elevated to the centre of English society, a whirlwind engagement that seems to promise a fairy tale ending. Parliament is shifting in Alistair's favour, the gossip columns are drunk on speculation, and the Derbyshire estate that belonged to Eleanor's father is finally on its way back into her hands. But behind closed doors, when the candles burn low and the music is gone, both of them know the truth is far more complicated. The bargain was supposed to be simple. 2 weeks of performance, a handful of carefully chosen appearances, then a mutually respectful and elegantly crafted broken engagement to satisfy society's curiosity without leaving a permanent stain. Eleanor would reclaim her lands and her independence. Alistair would secure his political victories. Their lives would diverge neatly along the lines they had drawn, hers in the quiet safety of the countryside, his in the ruthless heat of London's power. Yet as the city awakens to the scandalously romantic news of their engagement, neither Eleanor nor Alistair can shake the memory of moments that were never part of the script. Her honesty cutting through the armour he has worn for years, his steadiness anchoring her in rooms that would have once devoured her, the way their eyes met on a winter terrace and said far more than prudence allowed. In the days that follow, the performance continues. There are dinners to attend, where Eleanor sits at Alistair's right hand and watches him negotiate with ministers, who now view him through a softer lens. There are charity calls and Christmas visits, church services, and tightly curated social occasions, all designed to reinforce the image of a couple bound not by convenience, but by feeling. Each outing forces them closer, pushing them into shared carriages, whispered asides, private jokes that begin as strategy and slowly become something else. Eleanor, who once believed she could step cleanly in and out of this world, finds it increasingly difficult to separate role from reality. In Blackmore House, she sees glimpses of the man behind the Duke, a brother worried for his sister's futures, a son still haunted by the cold marriage that shaped his views on love, a strategist whose ambitions genuinely reach beyond his own gain. She discovers that the powerful, ruthless figure the world fears also sits up too late over maps and reports, chasing a vision of an England stronger and more stable than the one he inherited. At the same time, she must reckon with what it means to step back into a life of her own. Plans for the Derbyshire estate begin to arrive, documents, inventories, letters from stewards who never expected her to be truly in control. She must decide what to repair, whom to dismiss, how to reclaim a place that holds both her fondest memories and her deepest fears of being trapped again in a house that is hers only in name. The future, for the first time in years, is not a void. It is a landscape she must consciously design. For Alistair, the danger is subtler and more insidious. He is a man who has built his life on calculation, on seeing 3 moves ahead where others see only 1. Yet no matter how he tries to treat this engagement as just another instrument in his arsenal, his thoughts betray him. He finds himself listening for her laughter at the far end of a salon. He catches himself remembering the exact way she lifts her chin when she's bracing to face judgment. He begins to weigh not just votes and trade routes, but the look in her eyes when she hears him described as ruthless. As the end of their agreed-upon 2 weeks approaches, pressure mounts from every side. Society wants a wedding date. Newspapers hint at the great love story of the season. Political allies begin to talk of the stabilizing effect a duchess might have on a duke's more controversial projects. Even Eleanor's future in Derbyshire becomes entangled. Local gentry write curious letters, suddenly eager to curry favor with the woman who might yet become one of the highest-ranking ladies in the land. Then come the complications neither of them anticipated. A creditor from Eleanor's past resurfaces, suspicious of how neatly the Ravenshade debts have vanished. A political rival decides the engagement is too convenient, too well-timed, and begins to dig for proof that it is exactly what it appears to be, a beautiful lie. Old adversaries of Blackmore see an opportunity in questioning Eleanor's motives, insinuating that she is a grasping widow who has set her sights on the richest prize in England. Whispers begin to circulate that if the engagement collapses, it will not be mutual. It will be because she has somehow failed to be worthy of him. Faced with these attacks, Eleanor must decide how far she is willing to go to protect her own name and the fragile respect she has earned. Does she retreat to Derbyshire early, sacrificing pride for safety? Does she stand her ground in London and risk becoming a scandal instead of a curiosity? Or does she demand that Alistair step fully into the story they created and defend her as if their engagement were not temporary at all? Alistair, in turn, must confront the cost of the path he has chosen. To admit publicly that the engagement was a ploy would destroy not only her reputation, but his own credibility. A man who would use a woman so cynically is a man whose motives can never again be trusted. To end the engagement quietly, as planned, will now look less like a gentle parting and more like rejection, and to maintain the fiction, perhaps even turn it into truth, requires him to accept a vulnerability he has spent his entire adult life avoiding. The Duke, who believed he could control every outcome, suddenly faces the one arena where power, money, and influence offer no guarantees: the human heart. Beyond London, the Derbyshire estate waits like an unanswered question. It represents everything Eleanor thought she wanted: independence, stability, a place that is hers alone. Yet the more she steps into her role at Alistair's side, the more complicated that vision becomes. She begins to see that independence is not only a matter of land and income, but of choosing where and with whom she will build her life. Will she retreat to the quiet of the countryside, closing the door on a world that nearly destroyed her once before? Or will she claim a new kind of strength, one that allows her to stand in the brutal light of London's attention without losing herself? In the end, both Eleanor and Alistair will have to answer questions they never included in their original bargain. What does it mean to truly protect someone, to shield them from risk, or to stand beside them as they face it? Is love a weakness that makes them vulnerable, or a force potent enough to reshape the very power structures they have been navigating alone? And if the lie they crafted has become the truest thing either of them has ever known, do they have the courage to admit it, to each other, and to a society that believes it already knows their story? This is not simply a tale of a duke and a lady, playing at being in love for the sake of politics. It is the story of what happens after the curtain falls on the first act, when the lights dim, the costumes come off, and two people are left alone with the roles they played and the feelings they can no longer dismiss. As Christmas fades into the new year and the 2-week deadline draws near, Eleanor and Alistair must decide whether to cling to the safe, well-drawn lines of their original pact, or risk everything: reputation, influence, even the estates and legislation they fought for the uncharted, perilous possibility of a life lived together, not as actors on a stage, but as partners in truth. Thank you so much for staying with Eleanor and the Duke of Blackmore until the end of this story. Your time, your imagination, and your heart mean everything to keeping this world of historical romance alive. If this story touched you in any way, if you recognized a part of yourself in Eleanor's courage, or if you secretly fell a little in love with Alistair along the way, here's a special invitation just for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Leave a comment sharing what you loved most. Eleanor's strength, the Duke's control, the Christmas ball, the dangerous bargain, or that moment when the lie started to feel like the truth. Like the video to let us know you want more intense romances like this one. Turn on notifications so you're always the first to know when a new love story full of intrigue, emotion, and passion arrives. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for imagining with us. May you always find in stories and in life the kind of love that honors your strength and your courage. See you in the next story.